She gave him everything. He destroyed it in a single night. Evelyn Moreau walked into her own bedroom and found the unforgivable. Not a stranger, not an enemy. The man she was 3 days away from marrying, tangled in the sheets with her own sister. No screaming, no confrontation, no dramatic collapse against the doorframe. She simply stood there long enough for the image to burn itself permanently behind her eyes. Then she set her engagement ring on the nightstand, turned around, and walked out of the life she had spent 2 years building. She never looked back. Not once. But she didn't know, couldn't have known, that she was already carrying the one secret powerful enough to drag her back into the storm she had just escaped. Drop a like and comment your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me until the very end, because nothing about what happens next is simple. The ring caught the light before she set it down. That was the detail Evelyn would remember years later. Not the sounds coming from behind the half-open door, not the particular angle of afternoon light cutting through the curtains, not even her sister's voice saying her name in that broken, desperate way people say things when they know it's already too late for words to fix anything. What she would remember, with the kind of precision that only trauma manufactures, was the way her diamond engagement ring caught the last of the October sun as she pulled it from her finger and placed it on the dark wood of the nightstand. Quiet, deliberate, final. She had come home early because of a headache, that was all. A headache and a canceled meeting and the simple, innocent decision to skip the cab and walk the 12 blocks from her office back to the apartment she shared with Damien Rossetti, the man who had once told her on a rainy Tuesday over bad coffee that she was the only thing in the world that scared him. She had laughed when he said it. She had believed him completely. The walk home had taken 20 minutes. She had stopped at a bakery on Via Condotti and bought 2 almond croissants because Damien loved them. Because she was the kind of woman who still did small things like that, even after 2 years, even when the relationship had grown comfortable enough that most people stopped trying. She had climbed the stairs instead of taking the elevator because the October air had done something to her lungs that she liked, something clean and sharp and alive. She had turned her key in the lock with a white paper bag in her hand and croissant sugar on her fingers. The apartment was not empty. She knew before she reached the bedroom. Something in the quality of the silence was wrong. Too thick, too layered with something that didn't belong. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself the headache was making her strange. She pushed the bedroom door open with 2 fingers, the way you push open a door when you're trying not to wake someone. And the first thing she saw was Celeste's red coat draped over the back of the chair by the window. Her sister's coat, in her bedroom. The rest of it arranged itself in front of her like a sentence she couldn't stop reading. Damien was asleep, or close to it. That heavy, boneless state men fall into after they've had too much to drink and too much of everything else. His dark hair was pushed back from his face in a way that made him look almost young, almost harmless, almost like the man she'd fallen in love with in a hotel bar in Florence when she was 26 and stupid enough to think that love was something that could survive contact with people like him. Celeste was curled against his side with her dark hair spread across his chest, her breathing slow and even. Her red lipstick still somehow intact in a way that made Evelyn's stomach turn completely over. 23 seconds. She counted later. 23 seconds she stood in that doorway with a bag of almond croissants in her hand, and her whole understanding of the world rearranging itself into something unrecognizable. Long enough to see everything. Long enough for the image to calcify into something permanent and architectural. Something that would form the foundation of every decision she made for the next 5 years. Then she set the bag down on the dresser, pulled the ring from her finger, placed it on the nightstand with a small, precise click that was quieter than a whisper, walked to the closet, pulled out the single overnight bag she kept on the top shelf for work trips, and began to pack. She did not shake. She did not cry. She moved through the apartment with the focused efficiency of a woman performing surgery on herself, cutting away everything that couldn't come with her, the framed photographs, the good dresses, the version of her life that had existed an hour ago. She took her passport, her laptop, the small leather journal her mother had given her before she died, and 3 changes of clothes. She wrote the note in the kitchen on a piece of paper she tore from a grocery list. 2 words. She didn't agonize over them. There was nothing else to say that those 2 words didn't already contain. I saw. She left it on the kitchen counter next to the almond croissants. Then she walked out, and the door closed behind her with a sound so ordinary it was almost insulting. Damien Rossetti woke at 4 in the morning with a headache that felt like his skull was being slowly separated from itself and a gap in his memory that swallowed everything after the second bottle of scotch. He registered 3 things in rapid, devastating sequence. He was in his own bed. He was not alone. And the woman beside him had hair that smelled wrong. Not Evelyn's particular combination of cedar and something floral he'd never been able to name, but something heavier, more deliberate, the kind of scent that came from an expensive bottle and announced itself in a room before the person wearing it arrived. He sat up so fast the room tilted. Celeste Moreau opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression that contained in equal measure guilt and defiance and something else he couldn't immediately categorize but would later identify as calculation. Damien, don't. The word came out flat and absolute. He was already standing, already pulling on the clothes he found on the floor, already understanding with the particular clarity that only arrives at 4 in the morning when you're sober enough to see everything but too wrecked to have been able to prevent any of it. The scotch. The fight he'd had with his underboss Marco that had sent him home early. Celeste appearing at the door. He remembered that now. The knock. Her standing in the hallway with wet eyes saying she needed to talk about Evelyn, saying she was worried, saying something about the wedding, and him being drunk enough, stupid enough, catastrophically enough, to let her inside. After that, the memory dissolved into static. But the evidence was in front of him with the kind of brutal clarity that required no memory at all. He walked out of the bedroom and stopped in the kitchen doorway. The overnight bag was gone. He knew it before he checked. Something in the apartment had changed its quality, shed a particular kind of warmth that had nothing to do with temperature, and the absence of it sat in his chest like something dropped from a great height. He found the note, 2 words. He stood in his kitchen at 4 in the morning and read those 2 words 11 times. Then he sat down on the kitchen floor. Damien Rossetti, who ran the most feared criminal organization in northern Italy, who had put men in the ground without losing sleep over it, who had walked through a hail of bullets at 24 years old and come out the other side with nothing but a scar along his left rib cage. And he sat on his kitchen floor with a piece of torn grocery list in his hands and felt the specific, irreversible sensation of a life coming apart. The almond croissants sat on the counter in their white paper bag. She had brought him croissants. She had come home and she had brought him croissants, and he crushed the note in his fist and put his forehead against the cabinet and breathed through his nose until the thing in his chest stopped feeling like it was going to kill him. Then he stood up. Because sitting on the floor had never solved a single problem in his life, and it wasn't going to start now. He called Marco at 4:15. I need every asset we have, every contact, every informant, every favor anyone on this continent owes me. His voice was steady. That was the thing about Damien. The worse it got, the quieter he became. Evelyn is gone. Find her. Marco, who had worked for the Rossetti family for 16 years and prided himself on being unshakable, was silent for a moment. Then, gone how? Gone. The word was a wall. Just find her. She took a train to Milan, then a flight to Lisbon under her own name. She hadn't thought yet, wasn't thinking clearly enough to cover her tracks, was operating on pure animal instinct, the kind that tells you to put distance between yourself and pain regardless of direction. She sat in the window seat and watched Italy disappear beneath clouds, and felt nothing that she could name. Not grief, not rage, not relief. Something that existed below all of those, some bedrock layer of self that remained untranslated by language. The woman in the aisle seat asked if she was all right. Evelyn told her she had a headache, which was true, which was where all of this had started. She had 3,000 euros in her account, her own money, not the apartment expenses she'd shared with Damien, not the card he'd added her to 18 months ago that she'd always been quietly uncomfortable using. She had her passport and her laptop and her mother's journal and the overnight bag and the clothes she'd grabbed without looking. She had nothing else. She checked into a cheap hotel in Lisbon's Alfama district and sat on the bed and stared at the wall for a long time. The plaster was water-stained in a pattern that vaguely suggested a coastline. She traced it with her eyes the way you trace something when your brain needs to occupy itself with something small and manageable while the larger machinery processes something it wasn't built to handle. She did not call her sister. She did not call Damien. She turned off her phone, removed the SIM card, and dropped the card into the toilet. Then she slept for 14 hours straight, The deep, blank bottom of the ocean sleep of someone whose body has decided that consciousness is temporarily unsustainable. She found out she was pregnant on a Tuesday, 5 weeks after she arrived in Portugal. She had been telling herself it was stress. She had been telling herself a lot of things, that the nausea was bad food, that the exhaustion was the aftermath of emotional upheaval, that the dull ache behind her sternum was grief, and not something else. Not something that would require her to completely restructure the fragile scaffolding she'd spent 5 weeks constructing around her new, smaller life. The test sat on the bathroom counter of the tiny apartment she'd rented on Rua das Flores. She had found work doing remote translation work. Her Portuguese had always been strong. She was getting by. And she stared at it with the same focused stillness she'd brought to the nightstand in Rome. 2 lines. She sat on the edge of the bathtub and pressed both hands flat against her thighs and breathed. Outside, Lisbon was doing what it always did in November. Gray sky, sea wind, the particular damp cold that seeps through stone walls regardless of the heaters you run. A tram rattled past on the street below. Someone was arguing in the apartment next door, the rhythm of it muffled but recognizable. The specific cadence of 2 people who love each other and can't stop hurting each other anyway. She thought about Damien, not the Damien from the bedroom, the other one, the one she'd met in Florence, who had sat across from her at a bar he'd wandered into by accident and spent 3 hours making her laugh. The one who had driven 4 hours in a rainstorm to bring her soup when she had the flu because she'd mentioned it in passing and he'd remembered. The one who had told her she scared him. She thought about what that Damien's child would grow up inside. The empire, the violence, the particular architecture of fear that Damien had built around himself and everyone he claimed to protect. She knew what his world was. She had chosen to love him knowing what it cost, telling herself that she could hold that line, that she could build a clean space inside a dirty world. She had been wrong about that, and she had been wrong about him, and she was not going to be wrong a 3rd time. She placed one hand over her stomach. "Okay," she said, to no one in particular, to the gray Lisbon sky outside the small frosted window. "Okay, we figure this out." It took Damien 4 months to lose her trail completely. He'd had her as far as Lisbon. A hotel record, a passport scan at the airport, a credit card charge at a supermarket on Rua Augusta. Then nothing. As if she'd understood that he was following her electronically and had simply stepped sideways out of existence. No more card use, no digital footprint, no mobile signal. She had gone so thoroughly dark that even the people he paid significant amounts of money to find significant people came back to him with empty hands and apologetic expressions. He nearly broke Marco's jaw in the 3rd month. Stopped himself, apologized, which was not something Damien Rossetti did easily or often, and Marco had the dignity not to comment on it. The search continued, because stopping was not something Damien knew how to do. Meanwhile, the empire he'd inherited from his father required tending. Rival families were watching the Rossetti operation for signs of weakness, for cracks in the structure that could be leveraged. Damien had been distracted, and distraction in his world was an invitation. He handled it the way he handled everything, with cold efficiency and the particular brand of controlled violence that had made his name synonymous, in certain circles, with the specific sensation of a door closing forever. He was feared. He was effective. He was, beneath the surface of all of it, in a level of private pain that he shared with no one and allowed himself to feel only in the 4 in the morning hours when there was no performance required. He did not touch another woman, not out of nobility, out of the simple, brutal fact that he couldn't make himself want to. Every time he tried to envision it, and he was a practical man, he tried. The same image assembled itself in front of him, Evelyn's engagement ring on the nightstand, placed with that terrible precision, the sound of it settling against the wood, the quietest, most final sound he had ever heard. He had done that. He had taken the one thing that was actually his, and he had destroyed it with his own hands, and the weight of it was something he had decided to carry without putting it down, because putting it down felt like another kind of betrayal, like pretending it hadn't happened, like becoming the kind of man who could do what he'd done and simply move forward. He was not going to be that man, so he searched, and he waited. And he ran his empire with one hand while the other hand kept all of its available resources pointed toward a woman who had decided, with complete justification, that he didn't deserve to find her. She named them Noah and Ethan. Noah came first, 7 minutes ahead of his brother, and announced himself with the kind of furious, full-throated conviction that suggested he had opinions about everything already and intended to share them at volume. Ethan came second, quieter, wide-eyed, studying the delivery room ceiling with an expression of focused concentration that made the nurse laugh. Evelyn lay in the hospital bed in the small maternity clinic in Cascais, 20 minutes north of Lisbon, and held one boy in each arm and felt something move through her that she couldn't have named with any word she knew in any of the 4 languages she spoke. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was larger than happiness, more structural, more permanent, the way a continent is larger than a country. She had given them her mother's surname, Moreau, not Rossetti. She had built the new identity carefully over the preceding months. New documents, a paper trail that pointed nowhere, a story she'd practiced until it no longer required effort. She was a Canadian translator who had fallen in love with Portugal. She had been briefly married. Her husband was no longer in the picture. Simple, clean, survivable. She looked at Noah's dark eyes and Ethan's dark eyes. Rossetti eyes, unmistakably. The same unusual shade of charcoal gray that she had fallen in love with across a bar in Florence. And she made herself a promise she intended to keep for the rest of her life. These boys would not grow up inside the empire. They would not carry the weight of a name that meant violence and fear and the particular kind of power that costs everything it touches. They would grow up clean. They would grow up safe. Even if it meant she had to disappear so completely that the man who had helped make them could never find his way back. She kissed Noah's forehead, then Ethan's. Outside, the Atlantic pushed itself against the Portuguese coast with its old, indifferent persistence. In Rome, Damien Rossetti was sitting at the desk in his study at 4 in the morning, looking at a map of Europe with 14 marked points and running the same set of calculations he'd been running for months, unaware that the number of people he was looking for had just grown from 1 to 3. Evelyn pulled her sons closer and closed her eyes. She thought she was safe. She was wrong. 5 years later, a facial recognition system built for tracking cartel movement across the European coast pinged on a grainy photograph from a market in a small Portuguese coastal town. The woman in the photograph was buying oranges. She had cut her hair and changed her name and built a life so carefully constructed that it should have been invisible. But she had Evelyn's particular way of standing, weight shifted left, chin slightly angled, and the algorithm flagged it in 0.3 seconds. The report landed on Marco's desk at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday. He read it twice. Then he picked up the phone and called the one number he had never once considered not calling in 16 years of service. "Boss," he said when Damien answered, "I found her." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 4 seconds. "Send me the coordinates." Damien was already moving before Marco finished the sentence. He didn't ask for confirmation, didn't request a second verification, didn't demand the full report be read to him over the phone the way he handled every other piece of intelligence that crossed his desk. He just said, "Send me the coordinates," and hung up, and stood in the center of his study in the pre-dawn dark of Rome, breathing through his nose with the controlled deliberateness of a man who has just received news that could either save him or finish destroying him and hasn't yet determined which. The coordinates came through in 40 seconds. A town called Cascais, 20 minutes north of Lisbon on the Atlantic coast. Population small enough that a woman who wanted to disappear could do it properly, large enough that she wouldn't stand out. He pulled up the photograph Marco had attached. She was buying oranges. Her hair was shorter, quiche, cut blunt at the jaw, darker than he remembered, though that might have been the light. She was wearing a gray jacket he didn't recognize and carrying a canvas bag and looking at something slightly off to the left of the camera with an expression of focused concentration that he recognized with the particular violence of a memory that has been compressed under pressure for 5 years and released all at once. He sat down, then stood back up because sitting felt like something he couldn't afford right now. "Marco," he called back. "I need a car at the airstrip in 40 minutes. Private flight. 2 men, not more. I don't want to arrive like an invasion. And I want everything on that town. Every street, every business, her exact address if you have it, her daily patterns if anyone's been watching long enough to establish them. Boss." Marco's voice had that particular careful quality it got when he was about to say something Damien wasn't going to like. "There's something else in the report." Damien waited. "The photograph. It was taken at a market." A pause. She wasn't alone. Damien said nothing. There were two boys with her, maybe 4, 5 years old. Twins, looks like. Dark hair. The analyst flagged them because Marco stopped, started again. Because they've got your eyes, Damien. That's a direct quote from the analyst. Those were his exact words. The study was very quiet. Outside the window, Rome was doing what Rome always did at 5 in the morning, sitting in its ancient, indifferent darkness, completely unconcerned with the private catastrophes of the men who lived inside it. A pigeon moved on the windowsill. A car passed somewhere below. 40 minutes, Damien said. Have the car ready. He hung up and stood very still for a moment, then walked to the window and pressed one hand flat against the cold glass and looked at the city below and breathed. In, out, again. Sons. The word didn't feel real yet. It sat in his chest like a stone he hadn't finished processing. The weight of it present and undeniable, but the full shape of it not yet mapped. He was a man who dealt in facts, and the fact was this. If those boys were 5 years old, they had been conceived before the night everything collapsed. Before the scotch, and the disaster, and the 2 words on a piece of torn grocery paper. Which meant that when Evelyn had walked out of that apartment in Rome, she had been carrying his children and had chosen, deliberately, to raise them without telling him. He understood why. He understood it with a clarity that cost him something to acknowledge, that didn't make it easier to hold. He packed a bag in 8 minutes, changed clothes, drank half a cup of coffee standing at the kitchen counter, and left the rest. On his way out, he passed the kitchen doorway, and for one involuntary second his eyes went to the counter, where an empty space had existed for 5 years in the exact shape and dimension of a white paper bag containing 2 almond croissants. He walked out without looking back. The flight to Lisbon took 2 hours and 20 minutes. He sat in the back of the small jet with the file Marco had compiled spread across the table in front of him and read every page twice. Evelyn Moreau, now operating under the name Evelyn Laurent, her mother's middle name, he realized, which told him something about the state she'd been in when she'd chosen it, the particular way grief reaches for the familiar even when it's trying to disappear. Remote translation work, Portuguese and French and English, occasionally Spanish. A modest apartment in a building on the eastern edge of Cascais, 2 bedrooms, 3rd floor. The boys were enrolled in a local escola primaria under the names Noah Laurent and Ethan Laurent. Their mother walked them to school every morning at 8:15 and picked them up at 3. She had built a real life, a small one, a careful one, but real in all the ways that counted. Routines, a neighborhood, a fruit vendor at a market who apparently saved her the good oranges. He closed the file and looked out the window at the dark Atlantic below, and felt something move through him that was not pride and not grief exactly, but something adjacent to both. The specific ache of watching something grow without you, of understanding that time has passed in ways that cannot be retrieved. He landed in Lisbon at 6:45. A rental car was waiting. His 2 men, Costa and Reeves, the most discreet people he employed, which was saying something, took the front seats without comment. Damien sat in the back and watched Portugal slide past the windows as dawn came up gray and salt-smelling over the coast, and he told himself he was not going to walk up to her door and knock. He was going to watch first. He was going to understand what he was walking into before he walked into it. He was going to be careful, for once in his life, about the thing that mattered most. That resolution lasted approximately 4 hours. He watched from across the street as she came out of the building at 8:10. 5 minutes ahead of schedule. He registered that, cataloged it, the small evidence of the particular way anxiety manifests in people who run tight routines. She was wearing a dark coat he didn't recognize and carrying 2 school bags and talking to someone behind her, and then the door opened wider and they came out. 2 boys, dark-haired, rangy for their age, moving with the specific, barely controlled energy of 5-year-olds who have been told to behave and are giving it their best effort. The taller one was talking, already talking, hands moving, telling her something with the emphatic conviction of someone who considers every sentence important. The quieter one was looking at a pigeon on the pavement with an expression of focused scientific interest. They had her jaw, her particular way of holding their shoulders slightly squared like they were bracing against something. And they had his eyes. The analyst had been right. The coloring was unmistakable. That specific shade of charcoal gray that Damien had inherited from a grandfather he'd never met and passed to two sons he hadn't known existed until 48 hours ago. He sat in the back of the rental car with his hands on his knees and watched his family walk down a Portuguese street in the early morning light and breathed through the thing in his chest with everything he had. Costa said nothing. Reeves said nothing. They understood, without being told, that this was not a moment that invited comment. Evelyn walked the boys to school. She crouched down at the gate to zip one of their jackets. The taller one, Noah, who had apparently been fighting his zipper and losing, and said something that made both boys laugh, and then she kissed each of them on the forehead and stood up and watched them disappear through the school gate with an expression on her face that Damien had never seen there before. Something older than anything he remembered. Something that had been built slowly, over 5 years, out of the specific materials of solitude and responsibility and love that has no one else to lean on. She stood at the gate for a moment after they were gone, just standing. Then she squared her shoulders, the same gesture, the same precise angle. The boys had already learned it from her, and turned and walked back the way she'd come. Damien made the decision in the space of one breath. "Stay here," he said, and got out of the car. He followed her at a distance for half a block, close enough to close the gap quickly, far enough that she didn't register the footsteps behind her. She turned into a side street that ran parallel to the waterfront, narrower, quieter, lined with the kind of old tiled buildings that Lisbon puts everywhere like punctuation. He picked up his pace. "Evelyn." She stopped as if she had walked into something solid. Every muscle in her body locked at once. He could see it from 10 feet away. The full body recognition, the particular way the body responds to a voice it has spent years trying to forget and never quite managed. She didn't turn around immediately, just stood there on the tiled street with her back to him and her canvas bag in her hand and the Atlantic wind coming in off the water, and he watched her breathe. Watched her shoulders rise and fall once, deliberately, the way people breathe when they're deciding something. Then she turned. She looked exactly like herself, older in the specific way that difficulty ages people. Not worse, nothing like worse, but more defined, the architecture of her face sharpened by whatever the last 5 years had asked of her. Her eyes found his and stayed there with an expression he couldn't immediately read, which was new. He had always been able to read her. She had always been constitutionally incapable of hiding what she was feeling, had cursed herself for it regularly, and he had found it quietly devastating in the best possible way. Whatever she was feeling right now, she had learned to bury it deeper than he could reach on first look. "No," she said. One word, not a question, an answer to everything he hadn't said yet. "Evelyn, how long?" Her voice was flat and careful. Not the flatness of someone who feels nothing, the flatness of someone holding something at extraordinary cost. "How long have you been watching?" "I arrived this morning." "How did you find me?" "Facial recognition? A photograph from the market." He stopped, kept his hands visible, his posture open. He had thought about this moment 10,000 times in 5 years, and in none of those iterations had he imagined himself standing on a narrow Lisbon street at 8:30 in the morning, feeling this particular combination of relief and devastation. "I wasn't going to approach you. I was going to watch first, understand what I was—" He stopped again. "I saw them, Evelyn." Something moved across her face, gone before he could catalog it. "I'm not doing this here," she said. "Okay. Not at my apartment either." "Okay, you choose the place. Anywhere you want. I'll follow you." She looked at him for a long moment with those eyes he hadn't been able to stop seeing in 4 in the morning darkness for 5 years, and he made himself hold still under it, made himself take whatever was in that look without flinching or deflecting, because he owed her that at minimum, and probably considerably more. "There's a cafe on Rua Frederico Aruca," she said finally. "It opens at 9. We talk there, and then you leave." "All right. I mean it, Damien. You say what you came to say, and then you get back on whatever plane brought you here." He said nothing. She turned and walked, and he followed it 2 steps behind, and neither of them spoke for the 4 minutes it took to reach the cafe. The place was small, 6 tables, a glass case with pastries, a proprietor who nodded at Evelyn with the familiarity of someone who sees her regularly and didn't visibly register Damien's presence beyond a brief professional assessment. They took a table in the back corner. Evelyn sat with her back to the wall. Something she'd picked up from him, he realized. The habit of keeping the room in sight. Or maybe she'd developed it on her own, in the years of being alone and vigilant. The coffee came without being ordered. She had a regular order. Of course she did. Damien wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at her and didn't know where to start, which was not a feeling he was accustomed to. He was a man who always knew what to say in difficult situations because difficult situations were his professional baseline. But this was not a negotiation. This was not a threat to be managed or a rival to be outmaneuvered. This was Evelyn, sitting across from him in a cafe in Portugal, and she had 2 sons at school who had his eyes, and everything he might say felt simultaneously necessary and completely insufficient. "I'm not here to take them from you," he said. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "I know. I'm not here to... I don't have a prepared speech. I had one on the plane and I threw it out somewhere over the Bay of Biscay because it was garbage. It probably was. I need you to know that I know what I did. I'm not going to sit here and explain it or contextualize it. What I did that night was..." He stopped. His jaw worked. "There's no word I can put in front of it that makes it smaller than it is. I know that." Evelyn set her cup down with precise quietness. "You think I need you to tell me that?" "No. You think I spent 5 years waiting for you to sit across from me and confirm that you understand what you did? No. I know you don't need that." He met her eyes. "I needed to say it. That's different." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the cafe window, Cascais was waking up. Shop shutters rolling open, an older man walking a dog too large for the narrow street, a tram somewhere out of sight. Normal life, doing what it always did, completely indifferent to the specific gravity of 2 people at a corner table. "You have 2 sons," Evelyn said. Her voice was steady, but her hands had moved into her lap, out of sight. "They are 5 years old, they are healthy, and they are happy, and they speak 3 languages, and Noah thinks he wants to be a marine biologist, and Ethan has decided he can already read, which is partially true and mostly wishful thinking." She paused. "They don't know anything about you. They know they have a father who isn't in their lives. They know I love them. That has been enough." "Has it?" "Don't." The word came out sharp and immediate. "Don't make that into a question designed to suggest that I failed them. I haven't. I have given those boys everything I had, and what I had was considerable because I had no other choice and no other option and no backup and no..." She stopped, breathed. When she continued, her voice had returned to that careful flatness. "I did what I had to do." "I know you did." "Then what are you here for, Damien? Because watching isn't enough of an answer and talking isn't either. So tell me what you actually want." He held her gaze. "I want to know my sons." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of every possible response she could give to that sentence and the weight of her deciding between them. And Damien sat inside it without attempting to fill it, because the one thing he'd learned in 5 years of running an empire alone was that some silences have to be allowed to complete themselves. "That," Evelyn said finally, "is not your decision to make alone." "I know. Those boys have a life here, a routine, friends, a school they know and a neighborhood they're safe in, and a mother who has not once in 5 years let them feel the absence of everything they didn't have. I know. Stop saying that." "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to say something true that I don't already know." Her eyes were direct and unsentimental, and he had missed them with an acuity that he understood, sitting here now, was never going to fully resolve itself. "I want you to tell me one thing about the last 5 years that isn't about finding me. Something that isn't about the search, because you're not the only person who has been living." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I didn't touch another woman." She looked at him, not out of... "I'm not telling you that like it's a gift. It wasn't noble. I just couldn't." He turned his cup on the table slowly. "I've been running the organization my father built, expanded it, made it more feared, more effective, more everything a criminal empire is supposed to be when it's working." He paused. "I'm not proud of most of it. I'm better at this job than I ever wanted to be, and it has cost things I didn't understand I was going to have to pay until they were already gone." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, then, "Who knows you're here?" 2 men I trust completely. Marco, who you've met. That's it." No one else in the organization. No. Why does that matter? Something shifted in his expression. The first thing she'd seen there that looked like actual unease rather than controlled grief. Because there are people in my world who would see my sons as leverage, he said, who would use them to get to me the way people in my world use everything they can find. And I was careful about coming here because I understand that the moment I acknowledge them as mine, the moment that becomes known, it changes what they are to certain people. Evelyn went very still. I'm not saying that to frighten you, he said quickly. I'm saying it because you deserve to understand the full picture of what my being here means, what my finding you means. His voice dropped slightly. I've been careful, but careful isn't the same as invisible. And I have enemies, Evelyn, real ones. People who've been watching for a weakness for years. And we're the weakness. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and he watched her face go through something complex and private that she was choosing not to share, and he recognized it for what it was. A woman recalculating everything she thought she'd secured, redrawing the map of a life she'd believed was finally safe. I need you to leave today, she said. Her eyes came back to his. I need you to get on your plane and go back to Rome and give me time to think about this. All right, I mean it. No surveillance, no people watching my building, no more photographs. Evelyn, that is not negotiable. Her voice had the particular quality of someone who has been alone long enough to know exactly where their lines are. If you want any version of what you're asking for, you give me that. You give me the space to decide. Damien looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once. 2 weeks, he said. I'll give you 2 weeks. After that I'll contact you. Or I won't. And you'll live with whichever one it is. She picked up her coffee cup. Those are the terms. He sat with that, rolled it over, felt the full weight of it, which was considerable, and recognized that the man he'd been 5 years ago would have rejected it immediately because the man he'd been 5 years ago had believed that control was the same thing as safety. He was not that man anymore, or he was trying not to be. The distinction felt important, even if he couldn't yet prove it to anyone. All right, he said. He left 20 euros on the table, stood, looked at her one more time from the doorway. She wasn't looking at him, was staring at her cup with that new-to-him expression, the one with the depth he couldn't reach, and then walked out into the Cascades morning. He was back in the rental car and halfway to the Lisbon airstrip when his phone rang. Not Marco. Costa, who was driving. Boss. Costa's voice in the earpiece was flat and professional and contained something underneath it that made Damien's spine go rigid immediately. We've got a problem. What kind? Black SUV, Portuguese plates, but the registration is Ghost. It comes back to a shell company our analyst says links to the Ferrante family. A pause. It was parked outside the cafe when we left. It's been following us since. The Ferrante family. Milan-based. The one organization on the continent that had both the resources and the specific motivation to use leverage against the Rossetti operation and had been waiting for the right piece of leverage for 2 years. How long? Damien said, and his voice had gone to the particular register it got when he was not Damien who loved Evelyn, but Damien who ran an organization and made difficult decisions at speed. Unknown, could have been there when we arrived, could have followed us from the airstrip. Which meant they might have seen Evelyn, might have tracked her building, might already know about the cafe and the woman and the 2 boys at school down the street. Turn around, Damien said. Boss, turn the car around right now. He was already dialing Marco with his other hand, already running the calculation, already understanding with the sick, full-body clarity of a man who has spent his life reading threats that the 2 weeks Evelyn had asked for had just been reduced to nothing, because the Ferrante family had just found his weakness, and they were already in Cascais. The car hadn't finished turning around before Damien had Marco on the line. Ferrante, he said, before Marco could speak. How deep is their presence in Portugal right now? 3 seconds of silence while Marco pulled what he had. 3 seconds was a long time for Marco, which told Damien the answer was going to cost him something. Deeper than we knew, Marco said. We had them tracked to Barcelona and Lyon. Portugal wasn't on our map. Boss, if they're already in Cascais, They're already in Cascais. Black SUV, ghost registration, Ferrante Shell Company. They were parked outside the location where I met with her this morning. He paused. Which means either they followed me from the airstrip or they were already here before I landed. Another silence. Shorter this time, and worse. If they were here before you landed, Marco said carefully, then someone told them where to look. Damien said nothing. Let that sit for exactly the amount of time it needed to. I'll make calls, Marco said. You do that. And Marco, I need you on a plane to Lisbon inside 2 hours. Bring Ferreira and the Antonov twins. Nobody else. And I need everything you have on Ferrante's current operation structure. Who's running point in Iberia, what their extraction protocols look like, what they want badly enough to fly people to a Portuguese beach town. I already know what they want, Marco said. They want you compromised. They've been trying to find a lever for 2 years. And now they have one. He watched the Cascais streets through the window as Costa navigated back toward the cafe. Or they think they do. Get on the plane. He hung up, rolled the window down an inch. The salt air came in cold and sharp, and he breathed it and made himself think clearly because clarity was the only thing that was going to be useful in the next 60 minutes, and he could not afford to be Damien who loved Evelyn right now. He had to be the other one, the one he'd spent 5 years becoming, the one he was not proud of but was, at minimum, effective. Costa, what's the SUV doing? Still behind us, 3 car lengths. They're not being subtle. They're not trying to be. They want me to know they're there. He thought for a moment. Pull over on the next commercial block, somewhere visible, and get Reeves on the phone. I want him at the school in 10 minutes. The school? My sons are at that school. The words came out steady and flat, and Costa had the intelligence not to react to them. If the Ferrante people are here, and they know about Evelyn, then they know about the boys. I want Reeves at that gate before anyone else gets there. Costa was already dialing. Damien checked his watch. 8:54. School pickup wasn't until 3. 6 hours. A lot could happen in 6 hours, and none of the things he was currently imagining were acceptable. The car pulled to the curb on a busy commercial street. Damien got out, stood on the pavement with his hands in his coat pockets, and turned to face the black SUV, which had slowed and then stopped 20 meters back, engine idling, windows tinted dark enough that he couldn't see the occupants. He stared at it for 7 seconds. Then he turned and walked back toward the cafe. She was still there. He could see her through the window as he approached, still at the corner table, still with her hands wrapped around her cup, but no longer looking at it. She was looking at the door. She had watched him leave and then sat here and waited, which told him something about the state she was in, which told him she already understood on some level that something was wrong. She saw him come through the door, and her expression didn't change, but she sat up slightly, shoulders squaring in that way she had. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and said, very quietly, "Don't react to what I'm about to tell you." Her jaw tightened fractionally. "Don't tell me how to react. There's an SUV parked 20 meters down the street. It's been following me since I left here. The people inside it work for a criminal organization called the Ferrante family, based in Milan. They are here because they have been trying to find a way to compromise my operation for 2 years, and I have just handed them one by walking into this cafe this morning." Evelyn held his gaze. Her breathing didn't visibly change, but he saw her hands, which had been around the cup, slowly move to the table surface and press flat against it. The specific gesture of someone anchoring themselves. "The boys," she said. "I have a man going to the school right now." "That is not—" She stopped, started again, quieter, more controlled, which was somehow worse than if she'd raised her voice. "You have a man going to my son's school. As a precaution. Damien." Her voice was low, and she leaned forward across the table, and he could see now the thing she'd been keeping buried. It was coming up through the careful surface of her expression like water through concrete, and what it was not grief and not rage, but something that contained both, and was older than either. "Those boys have never been near anything that involves men like you. I have spent 5 years making absolutely certain of that. 5 years. And you've been in this town for 3 hours. I know." "Stop saying that. What do you want me to say? That it's not my fault? It is. You're right. 3 hours, and I've already—" He stopped, breathed. I can fix this. I need you to trust me for the next several hours. I don't trust you. I know that too. But trust me with this specific thing right now, in this specific situation, because I am the only person at this table who understands the people in that SUV and what they're willing to do, and I am not willing to have that argument while they're sitting 20 meters away watching us through a windshield. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked out the window at the street. He watched her identify the SUV. She was quick, always had been, picked up spatial details fast, and watched her look away from it with the particular effort of someone who has just confirmed something they were hoping wasn't real. "What do we do?" she said. "Not a concession, a tactical question. We leave separately. You go directly to the school and stay there until I tell you otherwise. Don't go back to your apartment." "My apartment has everything. I know. It's replaceable. You and the boys are not." He held her eyes. "Can you get the school to release them early? Pull them out at noon, say it's a family situation?" "Yes. The head teacher knows me. Do that. I'll have Costa meet you at the school gate. He's not what he looks like. He's good with children. He'll stay with you." "You're not coming." "Not immediately. I need to deal with what's in that car first." Something crossed her face that he couldn't read. She picked up her bag from the floor, pushed back her chair, then stopped, half standing, and looked at him across the table with an expression that was stripped of everything she'd been managing to keep contained for the last hour. "If anything happens to my boys," she said, "because of you, because of what you are, there is nothing on this earth that will ever, nothing is going to happen to your boys." His voice came out with a certainty he hadn't planned, that came from somewhere lower than strategy and colder than emotion. "I swear it to you on every worthless thing I've done in my life. Nothing touches them." She held his gaze for another second. Then she walked out the door. He watched her go, watched her turn left without looking at the SUV. "Good." He let out a slow breath, dropped 30 euros on the table, and pulled out his phone. What happened next took 11 minutes, and involved a conversation that Damien had on the pavement outside the cafe in a voice too quiet for anyone passing to hear, speaking to the driver of the SUV through a rolled-down window, which the driver eventually rolled down because standing in the rain, being stared at by Damien Rossetti for 4 uninterrupted minutes had apparently been enough to compromise whatever tactical patience the man had arrived with. The driver was young, mid-30s, thick through the shoulders, with the careful blank face of someone professionally trained to show nothing. His passenger was older, harder, with a scar along his left temple that curved into his hairline and eyes that moved constantly, cataloging exits. "Tell Ferrante," Damien said very quietly, through the window, "that I'm aware he's in Portugal. Tell him I'm aware of what he's looking for, and tell him that if he touches a single person in this town who is not me, a single person, I will burn every piece of infrastructure he has on this continent down to the foundations and salt the ground after." He paused. "That's not a threat. That's a schedule." The older man smiled, just slightly. The smile of someone who has heard speeches like this before and has a practiced relationship with their own lack of fear. "Mr. Rossetti," he said, with an Italian accent that placed him from somewhere south of Naples. "Mr. Ferrante extends his regards. He also extends an invitation. He suggests that a conversation between principals might be more productive than surveillance operations." He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket. Damien's hands moved fractionally before he stopped them, which the man registered. He produced a card. Plain white, single line of text. A phone number. "He suggests you call at your earliest convenience." Damien looked at the card. Took it. Looked at the older man for a moment longer. "He'll hear from me," he said. He walked away without looking back, which cost him something because every instinct he had was telling him to keep eyes on the car. He made it to the corner and turned and leaned against the building for a moment with his eyes closed, running through everything he knew about Ferrante, which was considerable and none of it reassuring. Silvio Ferrante, 61 years old. Second-generation criminal aristocracy with legitimate business interests in construction, shipping, and private equity that provided excellent cover for everything that mattered. Patient in ways that most men in his position weren't. He'd spent 2 years engineering this situation rather than making a direct move, which meant he was confident in his position and not in a hurry. The invitation was not an invitation. It was a demonstration. "He's here," He knows. He's composed about it, which meant he thought he already had what he needed, which meant the information leak was worse than Damien had calculated. He called Marco. "Talk to me about the leak," he said, before Marco could speak. "I've been making calls for the last 20 minutes. Marco's voice was careful in a way that made Damien's stomach go very still. "Damien, I think it came from inside." "How inside?" The pause that followed lasted long enough to constitute its own kind of answer. "Marco." His voice was flat and terrifying. "I don't have confirmation yet. I have patterns. The Ferrante people were already operational in Cascais before you landed. Our analysts confirmed it. The shell company registration dates back 6 weeks. 6 weeks ago, the only people who had active access to the search operation were you, me, and..." Another pause. "And Benedetti." Carlo Benedetti. Damien's head of intelligence, 15 years with the organization. The man who had built the facial recognition system that had found Evelyn in the first place. The man who had sent the report to Marco. Damien stood on a street corner in Cascais, Portugal, and felt the specific, nauseating quality of a betrayal that has been close enough to have touched everything that mattered and breathed through it with the slow deliberateness of someone performing surgery on their own reactions. "Where is Benedetti right now?" he said. "Rome. His apartment. He doesn't know I've been looking at him." "Keep it that way." He pushed off the wall, started walking. "Get me everything. Every communication he's had in the last 3 months. Every financial transaction. Every movement. And Marco, do it yourself. Not staff. You, personally." "Already started." A beat. "Damien, if it's Benedetti, then he gave Ferrante 6 weeks. 6 weeks to set up in Portugal before you even knew where she was." "I know what that means. It means they weren't following you this morning. They were already here waiting for you to arrive. They knew you were coming before you knew you were coming." Damien stopped walking, stood very still on the pavement while a woman pushed a stroller past him and a shop owner rolled out a display rack of postcards, and the perfectly ordinary machinery of a Tuesday morning in Cascais continued around him without acknowledgement. "It also means," Marco continued with the careful voice of a man delivering the final piece of the worst news, "that if Benedetti gave them the location 6 weeks ago, they've had 6 weeks to watch her. 6 weeks of her daily patterns, the school, the apartment, the market. 6 weeks, before Damien had even seen the photograph." "They know about the boys," Damien said, not a question. "They know about everything." He hung up, dialed Costa. "Where are you?" "School gate. She's inside. I have eyes on both exits." A pause. "The boys are..." "There's something, boss. The one that talks wouldn't stop asking me if I was a policeman. Under any other circumstance, that would have been something. Right now it landed in his chest like a stone. Nobody comes in or out without my authorization. I don't care what reason they give. If someone approaches that gate that you didn't bring there yourself, you call me before anything else happens. Understood?" "Understood." "And Costa, these are my sons." He paused, felt the weight of saying that aloud to someone who wasn't Evelyn, the strange and specific gravity of it, the way it changed the shape of everything. "These are my sons. Nothing else matters today." "I understand, boss." He was 3 blocks from the school when his phone buzzed. Not a call. A text from a number he didn't recognize. And the number didn't matter because the text was 3 words and they were sufficient. "We have Benedetti." He stopped walking. A second text came through 10 seconds later from the same number, and this one contained a photograph. Benedetti, in a location Damien didn't recognize, looking at the camera with an expression that contained a very specific combination of fear and the particular resignation of a man who has made his calculation and arrived at his answer and is simply waiting for the consequences. And underneath the photograph, 2 more words: "Call now." Damien looked at the card the man in the SU-5 had given him, looked at the text, looked up at the school building visible at the end of the street, where his sons were sitting in a classroom right now studying things 5-year-olds study, completely unaware that 6 weeks of careful observation had made them the most valuable pieces on a board game they had no idea they were playing. He dialed the number on the card. It rang once. "Damien." Silvio Ferrante's voice was exactly what his reputation suggested. Measured, warm, the voice of a man who genuinely enjoys conversation and considers violence a last resort primarily because he finds the alternatives more interesting. I'm glad you called. I was beginning to think you were angry with me. Tell me what you want. Straight to business. I've always respected that about you. A sound in the background for what? Something that might have been a chair moving. I want a conversation, as my associate told you. A real one. In person. I think you and I have been operating as adversaries for too long, when the truth is that we have considerably more in common than either of our organizations has been willing to acknowledge. You have my intelligence chief. Carlo has been my guest since yesterday evening. He's comfortable. He's been extremely cooperative, which I think speaks well of his practical intelligence, if not his loyalty to you. The warmth in Ferrante's voice didn't flicker. He's told me a great many things about your operation, your structure, your current vulnerabilities. But more relevantly, he's told me about the woman, about the children. Damien said nothing. 2 boys, Ferrante continued, 5 years old, enrolled under a false surname at a local school. Their mother has built quite an impressive life here, all things considered. I have genuine admiration for her resourcefulness. A pause, precisely calibrated. I would hate for any disruption to come to that life. Say it plainly. Plainly. Ferrante seemed to consider the word. I want your northern shipping routes, the Baltic Corridor and the Adriatic Channel both. I want them transferred to my operation over the next 18 months, quietly, in a way that looks voluntary and cooperative from the outside. In exchange, I remove my people from Cascais, I return Carlo to you in whatever condition you'd prefer to receive him, and your family continues their very pleasant life on the Portuguese coast without any further interference. The words were polished, the structure was elegant, and underneath both of those things was something Damien recognized immediately as the specific quality of a threat delivered by someone who knows they're holding every card and has had 6 weeks to make sure of it. And if I refuse, Damien said, then I think the situation in Cascais becomes considerably more complicated. Another pause. I have people 3 minutes from that school, Damien. I want you to understand that's not a bluff. That's geography. Damien's hand tightened on the phone. I need 12 hours, he said, to move my operation structure in a way that makes what you're asking logistically possible. You can't reroute 2 major corridors without internal preparation that takes time. 6 hours, Ferrante said. I'm reasonable, not patient. 8. A beat. 8 hours. Then I expect a call with specifics. Another pause, and this one had something in it that was almost gentle, which was the most frightening quality it could have had. And Damien, don't try to move her. We'll know. My people have been watching that town for 6 weeks. There are fewer exits than you're probably calculating. The line went dead. Damien stood on the street and stared at nothing and let himself have 4 seconds of the full, unmediated weight of the situation. The betrayal, the threat, the clock now running, the 2 small boys 3 blocks away who were the reason all of this was happening and who had no idea any of it existed. 4 seconds. Then he put the phone in his pocket and started walking toward the school and made the calls he needed to make and began constructing in the part of his mind that had always been coldest and most effective, and that he had been trying in recent months to use less, the shape of what came next. Because Ferrante had made one mistake. One, in what was otherwise a well-constructed operation. He had given Damien 8 hours, and 8 hours was enough. Evelyn was in the school's small administrative office when he arrived, sitting in a chair beside the head teacher's desk with Noah on her left and Ethan on her right. Both boys with their backpacks in their laps, looking at him with the frank, comprehensive assessment that small children perform on strangers and that adults spend years learning to disguise. He stopped in the doorway. The head teacher said something he didn't register. He was looking at his sons. Noah looked back at him with those gray eyes and said, with the directness of someone who considers social filtering an inefficiency, "Who are you?" Damien opened his mouth, closed it. Evelyn said, very quietly, "He's someone Mama knows. It's okay." Noah considered this for a moment with the gravity of a 5-year-old conducting due diligence. Then he appeared to reach a conclusion and returned his attention to the zipper pull on his backpack, which had been occupying him before the interruption. Ethan continued to look at Damien for a moment longer, Then he said with absolute seriousness, "Your coat is the same color as our cat." "You have a cat," Damien said. His voice came out normal. He had no idea how. "He's called Sardine," Ethan said, "because of the smell." Evelyn stood up. She looked at Damien's face, and whatever she saw there changed her expression from controlled tension to something sharper. She said something quiet to the head teacher, who took the boys to look at a fish tank in the corner, and then she crossed to the doorway and looked at him. "What happened?" she said. "Not a question. We have approximately 8 hours to move you and the boys somewhere secure before this situation becomes unmanageable." He kept his voice low. "I'll explain everything, but I need you to decide right now, in the next 30 seconds, whether you trust me enough to let me do what needs to be done." She looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, he could hear Ethan explaining something about sardines to the head teacher with the patient thoroughness of a small expert. "This is happening because of you," she said. "Yes." "Because you came here." "Yes." "And the answer to a problem you created is for me to put my children in your hands." He held her gaze, didn't deflect, didn't offer the speech he didn't have, just stood in the doorway of a school administrator's office in Cascais and let the truth of what she'd said sit between them undecorated, because she deserved that, because there was nothing he could put in front of it to make it smaller, and he was done trying. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly what I'm asking. Exactly what—" She looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then she turned back to the room and said, with a steadiness he recognized as the particular courage of someone who has already paid too much and is willing to pay more because the alternative is worse, "Boys, we're going on a trip. Get your bags." Noah looked up from his zipper with immediate enthusiasm. "Where?" Evelyn looked at Damien. He looked back at her, and for one moment, one fraction of a second, in the administrative office of a school in a Portuguese coastal town with a clock running and enemies 3 minutes away, they were simply 2 people looking at each other across the distance of everything that had happened. "Somewhere safe," she said. It was the first thing she had said to him in 5 years that sounded even remotely like trust, and it arrived at the worst possible moment, and it landed in the center of his chest like something that had been falling for a very long time and had finally hit the ground. He turned and walked back out into the corridor and pulled out his phone and called Marco and said, very quietly, "I need the safe house in Sintra ready in 40 minutes, and I need you to find out if Ferrante has exit coverage on the N247. "Already looking," Marco said. "Damien, there's one more thing." Damien kept walking toward the exit. "What?" "Benedetti didn't just give them the location and the photograph. According to what I'm pulling from his communication records." Marco stopped. When he continued, his voice had the flat quality of someone reporting a fact that they wish were not a fact. "He gave them the search history, every step of how we found her, every database query, every flag, every piece of the trail going back 5 years." Damien pushed open the school's exterior door. Cold salt air, gray sky. Costa at the gate, scanning the street with the particular alertness of a man who has been told to treat everything as a threat. "Which means," Damien said, "which means Ferrante knows you've been looking for her for 5 years, knows how much she matters, knows the full extent of it." A pause. "He's not just using her as leverage for a shipping route, Damien. A man like Ferrante doesn't fly people to Portugal for a shipping route. The route is what he's asking for. What he actually wants is to own the fact that he found what you couldn't protect. He wants to own that permanently. Because if you give him the routes today, he comes back in 6 months with something else, and something else after that, and it never ends," Marco was saying, but Damien had already stopped listening because Costa had moved. Not a dramatic movement, just a half step to the left and a shift in his body angle, the kind of micro-adjustment a man makes when he has registered a threat and is repositioning without broadcasting the registration, and Damien had spent enough years around men like Costa to read it the way other people read weather. He followed Costa's sightline. The street looked normal. A woman with groceries, a teenager on a bicycle, a delivery truck idling at the corner with its hazard lights blinking orange against the gray morning. Normal in every detail except one. The delivery truck had been at that corner when Damien arrived at the school 20 minutes ago. Same position, same idling engine. No delivery had been made. "Marco," Damien said quietly into the phone. "I'll call you back." He crossed to Costa in 4 steps. "The truck." "I saw it," Costa said, without moving his eyes from the street. And there's a man in the doorway of the tabacaria across the road. He's been looking at his phone for 11 minutes without once actually looking at his phone. How many exits from the school? Front gate, which is here. Service entrance on the east side. I checked it when we arrived. It opens onto an alley that runs behind the building and connects to Rua Primero de Mayo, about 40 meters north. Get Reeves on the service entrance, right now. Don't use the radio. He handed Costa his car keys. Pull the rental around to the alley entrance. Do it casually. You're a father picking up his kid. I don't look like a father. Then be a convincing uncle. He met Costa's eyes for 1 second. 8 minutes. Can you do it? 6, Costa said, and walked. Damien went back inside. The head teacher was a small woman in her 50s named Donna Beatrice, who had the calm, unshockable quality of someone who has spent 30 years managing other people's emergencies in small rooms. She looked at Damien when he came back through the door and appeared to make a rapid assessment of what she was seeing on his face, because she turned without being asked and lifted both boys' backpacks from the floor and held them out. I'll need you to sign the early release form, she said. Of course. Evelyn had Noah by the hand and Ethan on her hip, which was an impressive physical feat given that Ethan was 5 years old and clearly had opinions about being carried, but was also, apparently, picking up on the quality of the room because he had gone quiet and watchful. He was looking at Damien again with those gray eyes and that focused, assessing expression. Damien signed the form. His handwriting was steady. He was proud of that in a detached, distant way. Service entrance, he said to Evelyn quietly as he handed the pen back. East side of the building. There's an alley. We go now. What's happening? We're being watched from the street. Probably 2 men, maybe more. We need to be in the car before they realize we're not coming out the front. She absorbed this in about 2 seconds. Then she set Ethan down, took his hand, took Noah's hand on the other side, and looked at Damien. Lead, she said. He led. The service entrance was a heavy door with a push bar that opened onto a narrow alley that smelled of salt and refuse and the particular damp of old stone. Reeves was already there, a lean, quiet man who had been with Damien for 7 years and whose particular gift was looking like he belonged wherever he was standing. He had positioned himself at the alley's entrance to Rua Primero de Mayo, scanning the street beyond with a posture of absolute leisure. The rental car came around the corner 30 seconds later. Costa driving, moving at the pace of someone who is not in a hurry, because being in a hurry draws attention. Get in the back, Damien said. Noah looked up at him. Is this an adventure? The question arrived with such uncomplicated enthusiasm that Damien felt something move through his chest that he had no business feeling in this specific moment. He crouched down to the boys' level, which put them eye to eye, and said with complete seriousness, Yes. You need to stay quiet until I tell you otherwise. Can you do that? Noah considered this with the gravity of someone being asked to perform a critical mission. Then he nodded, once, with a conviction that suggested he intended to be exceptional at it. What about you? Damien looked at Ethan. Ethan had found a small stone on the alley floor and was examining it. Without looking up, he said, I'm always quiet. Evelyn made a sound that might, in a different universe, have been almost a laugh. They were in the car and moving in under 4 minutes. Costa took the N247 north without being told, which was correct instinct. South went back through the center of town and the Ferrante positions Damien had already located. North went towards Sintra through the coastal hills, narrower roads, more variables, harder to follow without being spotted. Damien watched the mirror. Reeves was in the passenger seat, watching his own mirror. For 7 minutes there was nothing. Then Reeves said very quietly, Blue Peugeot. 2 cars back. It's been with us since the alley. Evelyn heard it. Her hand tightened on Ethan's knee and then deliberately relaxed. How good are you on these roads? Damien asked Costa. Better than whoever's following us. Prove it. What followed was 4 minutes that Damien was reasonably certain would feature in his nightmares, though probably not for the same reasons they would feature in Evelyn's. Costa drove the coastal N247 the way it was meant to be driven by someone who didn't respect their own mortality, taking the curves with a precision that came from either extensive training or a fundamental disagreement with the concept of consequences. And by the time they came through the second set of switchbacks above the coast, The blue Peugeot had fallen back far enough to have lost visual contact. Costa didn't slow down. The safe house in Sintra was a property the organization had held for 11 years under 3 different shell companies. A white-painted villa set back from the road behind a stone wall, modest from the outside, comprehensively prepared on the inside in the specific ways that mattered. Damien had used it twice before, both times for purposes he was not going to think about right now, while his sons were in the back seat asking Costa whether the car could go faster, and Costa, to his credit, saying probably, with what sounded like genuine consideration. They came through the gate at 11:47 in the morning. The gate closed behind them. Damien sat in the passenger seat for a moment after the engine cut and looked at the property and ran his calculations. 8 hours from Ferrante's call, 7 hours and 4 minutes remaining. He got out. Inside, the villa had the particular quality of a space that is maintained without being inhabited. Clean, stocked, impersonal in its functionality. There was food in the kitchen. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs with beds made tight as envelopes. There was a main room with sight lines to every entrance and windows that had been subtly treated to be opaque from the outside. Noah and Ethan conducted an immediate and thorough inspection of the ground floor, while Evelyn stood in the center of the main room and watched them with the expression Damien had first seen at the school gate. That older expression, the one built from 5 years of doing this alone. And waited. Damien came and stood near her. Not close, at a distance that indicated he understood the distinction between available and presuming. "Tell me everything," she said. He told her. All of it. Ferrante, the leak, Benedetti, the 8-hour clock, what Ferrante actually wanted versus what he said he wanted. He told her without softening any of it because she had asked for everything and she had earned everything, and she was not a woman who benefited from being protected from information that concerned her life. She listened without interrupting. He had always respected that about her. The quality of her attention when something mattered, the way she could hold a complicated piece of information and turn it and examine it without reacting until she'd finished examining it. When he was done, she said, "What's your plan?" "I'm not giving him the roots." "Obviously. What's your plan?" "I have Marco working on Benedetti's communications. If I can establish the full extent of what Ferrante was given and build a legal case around the intelligence breach, I have leverage with certain government contacts in Rome and Brussels who would find a Ferrante operation on Iberian soil very interesting." He paused. "That's the long game. The short game is that I need to draw his people away from this location and handle the direct threat before the 8 hours expire." "Handle it," she said. "Yes." "Which means," he met her eyes, "I'm going to meet with Ferrante." The room went quiet except for the sound of Noah explaining something to Ethan about the structural properties of the villa's stone wall, which he appeared to have opinions about. "Alone," Evelyn said, "with Costa and Reeves outside. But yes, the conversation is between me and him. And if he decides conversation isn't what he wants?" Damien said nothing. "Damien." Her voice had lost the careful flatness. What was underneath it was something direct and raw and completely unmanaged. "I have spent 5 years building a life without you in it, and I am not interested in— I can't—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "Those boys know you exist now. For approximately 3 hours. They know you exist. I cannot let that be the complete duration of their experience of having a father." He looked at her. "I'm not saying that for you," she said quickly. "I'm saying it for them." "I know." "Stop." "I know you're saying it for them, and I know the difference." He held her gaze. "I'm not planning to die in a meeting with Silvio Ferrante. I'm planning to outmaneuver him, which I can do, which is something I am genuinely good at on my best days, and today is going to have to be one of my best days." He paused. "But I need 2 hours. Can you stay here with Costa and Reeves for 2 hours?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Noah, who had moved on from the wall's structural analysis and was now attempting to explain something to Ethan using hand gestures of increasing complexity. Then she looked back at Damien. "Come back," she said. Flat. Non-negotiable. "Yes," he said. He left. The meeting with Ferrante was arranged through a single text to the number on the card, a location proposed and agreed to in under 4 minutes, which told Damien that Ferrante had been expecting the call and had his counter-proposal ready, which told Damien that Ferrante believed this was already over and was simply managing the administrative details of his victory. That belief was going to cost him. The location was a restaurant outside Sintra, closed for lunch service, opened for this, the particular privacy that money buys when it's enough money. Damien arrived first, which was intentional. He wanted to be seated when Ferrante walked in, wanted the psychological geometry of being the person who was already present and comfortable rather than the person making an entrance. He was on his second coffee when Ferrante came through the door. Silvio Ferrante looked like someone's grandfather. That was the first and most dangerous thing about him. The silver hair, the well-cut suit slightly too conservative for fashion, the reading glasses on a chain around his neck. The build of a man who had been athletic in his youth and had transitioned into the solid, settled physicality of someone who no longer needed to perform physical threat because his reputation performed it for him. He came in with two men behind him, registered Damien's two men at the bar, and smiled with what appeared to be genuine warmth. Damien. He sat across the table without being invited, which was its own statement. Thank you for this. Tell me what you actually want, Damien said. Not the shipping routes, what you actually want. Ferrante raised his eyebrows with the delighted expression of a man who has been asked a question he was hoping someone would think to ask. You're sharper than your reputation allows for, he said. People underestimate you because of the last few years. The distraction, the search. He waved a hand. They see a man in grief, and they stop looking for the strategist. What do you want? I want a seat at the table you've been building toward the French border. I want operational acknowledgement, not a partnership, not a merger. Acknowledgement, the understanding that my organization has standing in conversations that currently exclude us. He folded his hands on the table. The shipping routes were always a placeholder, a demonstration of leverage. What I want is considerably less expensive than two major corridors. Damien looked at him. Give me the Marseille introduction, Ferrante said. Your contact with the Delacroix network. A single introduction. You vouch for me. I sit in one conversation. I take it from there on my own merits. He paused. That's all. The Marseille introduction. 3 years of careful cultivation of the Delacroix network, the most significant emerging distribution operation in southern France, not yet aligned with any major Italian family, worth more in long-term strategic positioning than anything Ferrante had on the table to offer in exchange. Worth considerably more than a promise to leave a woman and 2 children alone in a Portuguese coastal town. Damien sat with this for 11 seconds, long enough to actually think it through rather than react to it. You flew people to Portugal and spent 6 weeks on surveillance and compromised one of my senior people, Damien said, for a dinner introduction. I spent 6 weeks on surveillance because I needed to know what you valued enough to negotiate over. Ferrante's smile was entirely without apology. You're a hard man to read, Damien. You have no obvious weaknesses, no vices, no debt, no ambitions that exceed your current position. I needed to find the thing you actually cared about. He paused. I found it. And Benedetti. Carlo is unhappy but unharmed. He'll be returned to you this afternoon in whatever condition you want to receive him. A slight pause. Though I'd imagine that conversation is going to be difficult for both of you. Damien looked at him, looked at the table, looked out the window at the Sintra hills going green and gray under the November clouds. The calculation was not complicated. The Marseille introduction was a cost. A significant one, potentially a long-term strategic cost, depending on how Ferrante leveraged it. But it was a cost that could be managed, mitigated, worked around in the months that followed. It was, in the language of the world he operated in, a recoverable loss. The alternative was a war with a man who had just demonstrated that he was more patient, more thorough, and more precisely aimed than Damien had given him credit for, fought on a timeline that was already unfavorable, with his family inside a safe house in Sintra and a 7-year-old, no, 5-year-old, he kept forgetting, kept trying to map them against his own remembered childhood, and a 5-year-old who thought this was an adventure. I'll need 48 hours to arrange the introduction properly, Damien said. Delacroix doesn't respond to cold contact. It needs to be managed. 48 hours is acceptable. Your people leave Cascais today, all of them, including the ones I haven't identified yet, and I'll know if you leave anyone. Agreed. Benedetti is returned to me this afternoon, alive and with all his fingers, which I mention only because I want us to be explicit about the terms. Ferrante smiled. Of course. And you and I have no further business after this. What you get is one introduction. What I get is the permanent end of your interest in my family. Any move toward them, directly or indirectly, in any form, at any point after today. Yes, Ferrante said, with the patience of a man who has heard this sentence before. I understand the consequences. They looked at each other across the table for a moment. Two men who operated in a world where handshakes meant more than contracts, and the specific quality of a man's gaze when he made a promise was the only verification system that mattered. Then we have an agreement, Ferrante said. Damien drove back to the villa in 22 minutes. He sat in the car outside the gate for a moment, engine idling, and went through what had just happened with the methodical thoroughness of a man completing a full-body assessment after a collision, checking each component, verifying the damage, calculating what held and what hadn't. He had given up Marseille. 3 years of work, a strategic position that his father, who had understood the value of French connections better than most, would have considered irreplaceable. He had done it in 11 seconds, which told him something about who he was now versus who he'd been 5 years ago. The man he'd been 5 years ago would have found a way to fight it, would have found the counter-leverage, run the aggressive play, accepted more risk to the people around him in exchange for not yielding the strategic ground. The man he'd been 5 years ago had considered the empire the thing worth protecting. He got out of the car and went inside. Evelyn was in the kitchen. She had apparently decided that the way to spend 2 hours in a safe house in Sintra, while her life was being renegotiated by her estranged former fiancé, was to feed her children, because she had found the kitchen stores and constructed what appeared to be a legitimate lunch from tinned goods and whatever fresh items had been stocked. Noah and Ethan were at the kitchen table with bowls of something that smelled like tomato soup and an argument in progress about something Damien couldn't follow, but that appeared to involve marine biology and whether octopuses were smarter than sharks. Evelyn looked up when he came through the kitchen door. Her eyes went over him quickly, the professional visual assessment of someone checking for damage. And then she looked at his face. It's done, he said. She held his gaze. And? It cost something, not them. Something replaceable. He paused. They're leaving Cascais today. It's over. She turned back to the stove, stirred something. The motion was even and controlled, and he watched the line of her shoulders and understood that she was doing the same thing she'd done in the cafe, managing the full weight of a response that she wasn't going to perform in front of him. Not because she didn't feel it, because she felt it so thoroughly that producing it here would be the same as handing him something she hadn't decided to give yet. Are you hungry? She said. The question was so ordinary it almost broke him. Yes, he said. He sat at the kitchen table across from his sons, who registered his presence with the brief, assessing glance of children who are deep in a debate and find adult intrusion broadly irrelevant, and Evelyn put a bowl in front of him without looking at him and went back to the counter, and for a few minutes the kitchen was just a kitchen, warm, tomato-smelling, inhabited by a family doing the small and ordinary thing of eating lunch, while the November hills outside went gray with approaching rain. Then Noah looked up from his bowl and examined Damien with those gray eyes and said, with the directness that appeared to be his primary mode of engagement with the world, "Are you staying?" The question landed in the center of the room and sat there, and everyone in the room heard it, and the word everyone was doing a lot of work in that sentence because Evelyn had gone very still at the counter. Damien looked at his son, felt the full weight of the question, which was heavier than any question he had been asked in a long time, heavier than anything Ferrante had put on the table an hour ago. Heavier than the specific combination of hope and terror that was sitting in his chest right now, making it difficult to breathe with full lung capacity. He looked at Evelyn's back, at the line of her shoulders and the careful stillness of her hands on the counter. She didn't turn around, but she was listening. He could feel it, the particular quality of a person's attention when they are waiting for an answer they have not given themselves permission to want. He looked back at Noah. "That's up to your mother," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. Ethan looked up from his soup, looked at Damien, looked at Evelyn's back. Then he said, with the absolute matter-of-fact certainty of a child who has considered the available data and reached a conclusion, "She'll say yes." Evelyn made a sound, just a small one, and her hand on the counter pressed flat against the surface, fingers spread, and Damien watched her breathe, watched her shoulders rise and fall once, twice, and outside the safe house in the Sintra Hills, the rain began to come down in earnest, heavy and cold against the windows. And inside the kitchen, the soup was getting warm, and his sons were watching him with those eyes, and the woman he had destroyed and was trying to rebuild something with was standing 6 feet away with everything they had ever been and everything they could still become, balanced on the sharp edge of a moment that had been 5 years in arriving. She turned around. Her eyes were dry and her jaw was set, and her expression was the most complicated thing he had ever tried to read. And he had spent 5 years becoming a man who could read complicated things, and even now he couldn't get all the way to the bottom of it. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "We need to talk. Tonight, after they're asleep. About conditions. About what this looks like. About what you have to do to be in their lives, and what that costs, and what I'm willing to allow and what I'm not." She paused. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were doing something she couldn't quite control. "I'm not forgiving anything tonight. I'm not even close to that, but I'm willing to have the conversation." Damien nodded. Once. He didn't add anything to it because there was nothing to add. "And Damien," she held his gaze, if anything like today ever happens again because of what you are, because of that world, because of choices you make in that life, I take the boys and I disappear. And this time you will not find me. There will be no facial recognition system advanced enough. Do you understand me?" "Yes," he said. "Do you believe me?" "Completely." She held his gaze for one more second, then she turned back to the stove. Noah returned to his soup, apparently satisfied with the resolution of the situation. Ethan was looking at Damien with that quiet, assessing expression. "I knew she'd say yes," Ethan said, and somewhere underneath the wreckage of the day, underneath the Ferrante meeting and the Marseille loss, and the 8 hours of controlled panic, and the 11 minutes of watching a blue Peugeot in a rear-view mirror, something in Damien's chest shifted 1 degree in a direction it hadn't moved in 5 years, toward something he didn't have a word for yet, but recognized. The way you recognize a coast you've been sailing toward in the dark. He picked up his spoon. Outside, the rain came down over Sintra, and inside the safe house kitchen, his family ate lunch, and the war that had started with a half-open door and a white paper bag and 2 words on a piece of torn grocery paper was not yet over. But for the first time in 5 years, it felt like something that might, eventually, be survived. The rain stopped sometime after midnight. Damien heard it, the specific quality of silence that replaces heavy rain. A silence that is fuller than ordinary silence because it contains the echo of everything that preceded it. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee in front of him, and the card Ferrante's man had given him on the table beside it. And he had been sitting there for 2 hours since Evelyn had put the boys to bed, and come back downstairs and stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and said, "Okay, talk." They had talked for a long time. Not the way people talk when they're performing honesty for an audience. Not the careful managed disclosure of 2 people in a negotiation, but the other kind. The kind that happens when it's past midnight and the children are asleep upstairs and there's nowhere left to go and nothing left to protect the conversation from. The kind that draws blood. She had told him what the first year had been like. Not the practical details. He'd constructed most of those from the file and from reading her well enough to know her specific brand of survival. But the interior of it. The nights in the Lisbon apartment when the loneliness had a physical weight. When she had sat on her bathroom floor at 3 a.m. with a belly she couldn't hide anymore and talked to her mother who was 4 years dead and asked her what to do. The delivery room in Cascais where she had held 2 newborns with no one beside her and experienced something so enormous and so solitary simultaneously that she had not been able to cry until 3 days later and then couldn't stop for 6 hours. He had not interrupted any of it, had not offered anything in the spaces she left. No apologies, no explanations, no attempts to contextualize his absence in a way that made it more bearable. He had understood, somewhere in the 2nd year of his search for her, that there were debts that couldn't be paid with words, and this was the first installment of the only currency that might eventually matter. His complete and undivided witness to what his actions had cost. When she finished, she was not crying. She had the dry, exhausted look of someone who has moved through something rather than around it. "Now you," she said. He told her about Celeste, the full version, not the 2-word summary she'd carried for 5 years, not the guilty man's edited account, but what he actually remembered and what he'd reconstructed from the parts of the night the scotch had swallowed. The fight with Marco that had sent him home early. The state he'd been in. Not drunk enough to misplace his moral agency, which was the version of the story that would have been easier to tell, but drunk enough to be stupid. Drunk enough to not ask the questions he should have asked when Celeste appeared at the door with wet eyes and a story about needing to talk about the wedding. "She said you were having doubts," he said. "That's what she told me. That you'd been talking to her about second thoughts. About whether you were ready for what marrying into my world meant." Evelyn was very still. "I know," he said. "I know it was a lie. I knew it 3 hours later when I was sober enough to think straight, and I have known it every day since. But I was drunk, and I was scared because the specific fear she named was the one I already carried, that you would eventually look clearly at what I was and decide it wasn't worth it." He paused. "I'm not using that as an excuse. I'm telling you because you asked for the truth, and the truth includes the part that makes me look not just faithless, but stupid, and you deserve the complete picture." She looked at him for a long time. Did she know what she was doing? Yes. He said it without hesitation because he had spent 5 years being certain of it. Celeste knew exactly what she was doing. I don't know what she wanted from it. Your position, the proximity to money, something older and darker between the two of you that I didn't have the full context to understand. But it was not an accident, and she was not a passive participant. The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it, more complex. He watched Evelyn's face go through something private and difficult that had nothing to do with him. The reckoning of a woman confronting the full truth about her sister, which was a separate wound, older and differently shaped. "She called me," Evelyn said finally, 3 weeks after I left. She called my old mobile before I destroyed the SIM. She was crying. She said she was sorry. She said it wasn't supposed to go that far." A pause. I didn't say anything. I listened to her cry for about 30 seconds, and then I ended the call and dropped the SIM in a Lisbon canal. "Did you ever—" "No, I never spoke to her again." Her voice was even. "I don't have a sister anymore. That's not a decision I made in anger. It's just what's true." He nodded. He didn't push on it because it wasn't his wound to manage. They sat with the quiet for a while. The safe house around them made the small sounds that old stone houses make at night, settling, contracting in the cold, the particular language of a building that has been standing long enough to have opinions about the weather. Upstairs, one of the boys made a sound in his sleep, unintelligible, brief, then silence again. Both of them heard it. Both of them looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Tell me what leaving the organization looks like," Evelyn said. "Specifically, not a general statement about intentions." He had expected this. Had spent part of the drive back from the Ferrante meeting constructing the honest version of the answer rather than the aspirational one. "It takes time," he said. 18 months, minimum. You can't walk out of an operation this size without creating a vacuum that gets filled by something worse, and I have people who depend on the structure for their safety, not just their income. I need to transition the organization in a way that doesn't get anyone killed." He paused. "I've already started, quietly. The Marseille position I surrendered today to Ferrante, I would have fought for that 2 years ago. I let it go because it was the cost of protecting you, and I didn't think twice. That's not the same as leaving." "No, it's the beginning of the direction." He met her eyes. "I'm not going to tell you I'm a different man. I'm telling you I'm a man trying to become one. And the difference between those two things matters, and I need you to let it matter." She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen light was low. She had turned off the overhead and left only the small lamp above the stove, and in that light she looked both older and younger than he could reconcile, which was something he was going to have to learn to hold. 18 months, she said, at the outside. And during those 18 months, I want to know my sons. I want to be present in whatever form you determine is safe and appropriate, and I will defer to your determination of what that is, and I will not pressure or argue." He paused. "I want to earn the right to disagree with you eventually, but that comes later. Right now, I defer." Something moved in her expression. Almost amusement, almost something else. "Ethan was right, wasn't he?" she said. "About what?" "He said I'd say yes." She looked at the table. 5-year-olds are inconveniently perceptive." Damien said nothing. Waited. She looked up. "I'm not saying yes to everything. I'm saying yes to the conversation continuing. To you being here, carefully, on terms we negotiate and renegotiate as things develop. She paused. And I'm saying yes to you coming back to Cascades with us tomorrow and meeting Sardine, who is going to hate you because he hates everyone. He looked at her. The cat, she said. Ethan's cat. I know who Sardine is. Just making sure.
And there it was, but barely there. Gone almost before he could catalog it. The specific, particular thing her mouth did when she was suppressing something she wasn't ready to acknowledge yet. He had missed it with a precision he hadn't allowed himself to examine, and seeing it now in a safe house kitchen at 1 a.m. with rainwater still dripping from the eaves outside felt like a door opening in a wall. He'd spent 5 years telling himself was permanent. He didn't reach for it, too soon, too much still standing between here and there. But he filed it away with the careful reverence of a man who has learned, at significant cost, to treat fragile things accordingly. They returned to Cascades the following morning in pale November sun that had followed the rain in the way Portuguese coastal light always does. Clear and cool and refractive, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly more deliberate than it actually is. The boys ate breakfast in the rental car with the cheerful efficiency of children who have decided that the last 24 hours constituted a satisfactory adventure and were ready to resume normal programming. Damien had arranged a hotel in Cascais for himself. Evelyn had been clear about that. She was not ready for him in her space, and he had agreed without qualification. He drove them to her building and carried both backpacks up to the third-floor apartment and stood in the hallway and did not go inside because she hadn't invited him inside and he had promised himself he was going to be the man who waited for the invitation. Noah, apparently, had not promised himself anything similar. "Come in," Noah said with the uncomplicated authority of a 5-year-old who has decided something. "I want to show you the fish book." Damien looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. Then she pushed the apartment door open wider and went inside without saying anything, which was its own answer. He went in. The apartment was small and real in all the ways the safe house hadn't been. There were drawings on the refrigerator, a pile of library books on the coffee table, a complicated blanket fort in the corner of the living room that appeared to have been abandoned mid-construction before yesterday's events had intervened. There were crayon marks on the baseboard that someone had made a partial attempt to clean and given up on. There was a gray cat sitting on the windowsill looking at the street with sovereign indifference. Sardine turned, registered Damien's presence, assessed him with the particular contempt of a cat. Encountering a person it has already decided is unnecessary, and turned back to the window. "He hates you," Ethan confirmed, appearing from the kitchen with an orange. "I noticed." "He hated me for 2 weeks before he liked me," Noah said, dragging a large picture book from under the coffee table. "So maybe in 2 weeks. Damien sat on the floor because Noah had sat on the floor with the book, and the table was too low for any other configuration. Evelyn moved around the apartment doing the particular form of quiet maintenance that follows absence, checking things, resetting the temperature on the radiator, filling the kettle. And he sat on the floor of his son's living room while Noah showed him, with the systematic dedication of a born naturalist, every species of marine life the book contained and their relevant properties. Ethan ate his orange. Sardine ignored everyone. Evelyn made tea. After 40 minutes, she sat on the couch above him with a cup in both hands and watched her son explain the difference between a nautilus and an ammonite to a man who was listening with his entire body, with the full and genuine attention of someone who is aware that this moment is not a small one, even if it looks small from the outside. And her expression did something she didn't appear to notice it doing. Damien noticed. He didn't say anything about it. The weeks that followed were the most uncomfortable and the most necessary of Damien Rossetti's adult life. He stayed in Cascais. He had told Marco he was unavailable for non-critical matters, and Marco, who had been with him for 16 years and who understood things without being told them, had said, of course, and handled it. Damien walked Noah and Ethan to school when Evelyn allowed it, which was not every day. He had coffee with Evelyn twice a week at a different cafe than the first one, because she had said she didn't want to go back to the first one and he hadn't asked why. He was present without crowding, available without presuming, patient in ways he was not naturally patient because the alternative to patience here was the only thing he was genuinely afraid of. Marco flew in once, in the third week, to brief him on the Benedetti situation.
They met at Damien's hotel, and Marco laid out everything his investigation had uncovered. The full extent of what Benedetti had sold to Ferrante, the financial trail, the duration of the relationship, which turned out to be 14 months rather than 6 weeks, which meant that parts of the search for Evelyn had been compromised in ways that would take time to fully audit. Damien listened. Then he said, "What do you recommend for Benedetti?" Marco looked at him. "In the old way or the new way?" It was not a question Marco had ever asked before. The fact that he asked it now told Damien that his direction of travel was visible even to the people who had known him longest. "The new way," Damien said. "Then I recommend we turn him over to the authorities in Rome with the financial evidence attached. He's looking at serious time. It ends his ability to damage us, and it's clean." A pause. "It's also not what he deserves." "No," Damien agreed. "But it's what we're doing." Marco nodded. "Once." Then he picked up his coffee cup and looked out the hotel window at the Cascais seafront and said, with the tone of a man confirming something he had already decided, "I'll be ready when you're ready to transition, just so you know that." Damien looked at him. 16 years, Marco said. "I know which way this is going. I've known since you called me from the floor of your kitchen at 4 in the morning 5 years ago." He paused. "I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying I'll be ready." The moment required acknowledgement and didn't require words, so Damien simply nodded, and that was enough between them. The conversation with Evelyn happened 6 weeks after Cascais, in her kitchen, on a Thursday evening after the boys were in bed. She had made dinner. An actual dinner, not the tinned goods construction of the safe house, but something deliberate, which Damien had registered without commenting on because commenting on it would have been the wrong move. They had eaten, and she had put the plates in the sink and then stood with her back to him for a moment before she turned around. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I don't forgive you." She held his gaze and he held it back because looking away would have been its own form of dishonesty. "I want to be clear about that. What you did that night, and what Celeste did, those things happened and they cost me 5 years and 2 children's first years without their father and a version of my life that I didn't get to live. I don't forgive that. I don't think I'm supposed to yet, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." "Okay," he said. "But I've been watching you for 6 weeks. She moved away from the sink and sat at the table across from him and put her hands flat on the surface. "I've been watching you with Noah. I've been watching you figure out how to be around Ethan, who is harder to read than Noah. And it took you about 10 days to figure out that the way to reach him is through questions rather than statements, and you figured it out because you were paying attention." She paused. "I've been watching you choose, every single day, to be here instead of there. And it's costing you things. I know it's costing you things. I can see it in how you look when Marco calls." He didn't deny it. "I'm not ready to say I trust you," she said, "but I'm ready to say that I see the effort, and I think—" She stopped. Her jaw worked for a moment. "I think the version of you sitting in this kitchen right now is different from the one I left. Not different enough yet, but pointed in a different direction. And I'm willing to point myself in the same direction for a while and see where we end up." It was not a declaration. It was not a resolution. It was the thing that it actually was. 2 damaged people with a complicated history and 2 children and a future that was not yet shaped sitting across a kitchen table at 10 in the evening and deciding to keep walking in the same direction for a little longer. He reached across the table, didn't take her hand, just placed his on the table near hers, close enough to be an intention, far enough to be a question. She looked at his hand, then at his face. Then she placed her hand over his. Once, briefly. Then she pulled it back and stood up and said she was going to check on the boys. He sat at the table and breathed and let the specific weight of that moment settle through him, the way weight settles when you finally put something down that you've been carrying for a long time. The full 18 months took 22. He had estimated correctly, but underestimated 2 variables: the complexity of transitioning the northern logistics without creating instability, and the number of people who had genuine claim on his time and his protection and whom he was not willing to abandon to uncertainty in the name of a cleaner timeline. He told Evelyn about every delay before it happened, not after. That had been her condition. No surprises, no optimistic revisions that turned out to be wrong. The truth about the timeline as he knew it, updated in real time. He kept that condition without exception. He was in Cascais for 60% of those 22 months. He was in Rome or elsewhere for the other 40. When he was away, he called every night at 7:30, which was the boys' pre-bedtime window, and talked to whoever wanted to talk, which was usually Noah about marine biology, and occasionally Ethan about whatever he was currently reading, and sometimes, after the boys had gone to bed, Evelyn, who had things to say once the performing for the children energy was down. Those were the conversations that did the actual work, not the dramatic ones. Not the late-night kitchen table conversation, or the confrontation at the cafe, or the moment in the safe house, when Ethan had said, "I knew she'd say yes," with the certainty of a small person who understood things the adults around him were still working out. The ordinary ones. The 10-minute calls about Noah's parent-teacher meeting, or Ethan's new obsession with tidal patterns, or the water heater in her apartment that made a sound she described as genuinely threatening. The ordinary, unglamorous, undramatic material of a shared life being rebuilt one day at a time from the rubble of the other one. The last piece of the organization transferred in month 22 on a Wednesday in February, documented and signed. The structure left in the hands of people he trusted to manage it in a way that required less violence than the way he'd inherited it. Not clean. It was never going to be clean. The world it existed in didn't allow for clean. But cleaner. The direction of travel was different. That was what he could honestly say. He was in Cascais when it happened. He told Evelyn that evening, at her kitchen table, with the boys doing homework in the next room and Sardine on the windowsill, who after 8 months had arrived at a grudging détente with Damien that expressed itself as the cat occasionally sitting near him while refusing to acknowledge his presence. She looked at him for a long time when he told her. Then she got up and refilled his coffee without being asked, which was such a small thing and such a, specifically, her thing that it landed in his chest like the end of something. He proposed in April. Not a production, not the large gesture he'd been capable of when he was younger and more confident and considerably less aware of how much confidence could cost. He did it on the waterfront in Cascais in the early evening, with the Atlantic doing what the Atlantic always does, present, indifferent, permanent, and the proposal was quiet and direct and undecorated. He told her he was not the same man she had left, and was not yet the man he intended to become, and that the distance between those 2 points was where he planned to spend the rest of his life, and that he wanted to spend it with her, and that he understood if she needed more time and he would wait, and that the ring he had was not the same one he'd given her the first time, because the first one was in a Portuguese canal somewhere, and that was probably where it belonged. She looked at the ring, then at the water, then at him. "The boys are going to be insufferable about this," she said. "Probably. Ethan is going to say he knew. He did know. That's the most annoying part." She looked at the ring again, then she held out her hand and he put it on her finger, and she looked at it for a moment in the April light. "You know this doesn't erase anything." "I know. It doesn't mean I've forgotten. I don't want you to forget. Forgetting would mean it didn't cost anything, and it cost everything." He held her gaze. "I'd rather you remember and choose this anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. The water moved behind her. Somewhere down the seafront, a child was laughing at something, and the sound carried on the salt air with the particular clarity of sounds that travel over water. "I remember," she said, "and I'm choosing this anyway." They walked back to the apartment in the lowering April light, and Noah opened the door before they knocked because he had apparently been watching from the window, which tracked, and he took one look at his mother's left hand and let out a sound of vindication that brought Ethan running from the back room. Ethan arrived in the hallway, assessed the situation in approximately 2 seconds, looked at Damien with those focused gray eyes, and said, with complete satisfaction, "I told you." "You did," Damien said. "I'm always right about these things." "You've been right about this one thing one time." "So far," Ethan said, and went back to his room. Noah was already asking about the wedding and whether there would be a boat involved because he had read that some people have weddings on boats, and he felt strongly that this was underutilized as a tradition. Evelyn was explaining that there would not be a boat with the patient specificity of someone who has learned that Noah requires complete sentences and evidence. Sardine had come to the hallway and was sitting near Damien's left foot with his back turned, which was the most affectionate the cat had ever been. Damien stood in the hallway of the apartment that was not yet his home and looked at his family, at the 2 dark-haired boys who had his eyes and her jaw, and the particular combination of traits that results when 2 specific people decide, however imperfectly, to love each other. At the woman who had walked out of his life with 2 words and no engagement ring, and had survived everything that followed with a completeness that humbled him, and felt the specific weight of a life arriving after being constructed piece by piece in the dark. He had not earned this. He understood that. What he had earned was the right to keep building it, which was different and was enough. Outside, Rome was still Rome. The city where everything had started and where the ring had stayed on the nightstand and where the worst night of his life had occurred. But that city was 3 countries away, and in this hallway in Cascaes, the rain that had followed them from Sintra had moved on to the north, and what remained was the ordinary April evening of a family at 7 o'clock doing the things families do, which were small and specific and more durable than anything else he had ever tried to build. He reached down and picked up the overnight bag he'd left by the door when they'd come back from the waterfront. "Stay for dinner," Evelyn said from the kitchen doorway. Not an invitation, not quite an order. Something in between that she had recently begun using and that he had come to understand meant the same thing either way. He set the bag back down. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." And the door closed behind him, and the April light fell across the hallway floor in long rectangles, and somewhere in the apartment Ethan was explaining something to Noah about tidal patterns in a tone of patient authority, and the cat sat near Damien's foot and faced the wall, and the kettle in the kitchen began to heat, and the ordinary, irreplaceable machinery of an evening at home moved forward the way it does, without drama, without announcement, the way all the things that actually matter tend to arrive. Not with fireworks, not with the clean resolution of a story that wraps everything in a bow and asks you to believe that damage can be fully undone. With this, a bag set back down in a hallway, a kettle, 2 boys and 1 cat and a woman in a kitchen doorway who had chosen, with full knowledge of the cost, to choose this anyway. That was all. It was enough. It was, in the end, everything.